So this lecture is a continuation of the last lecture. And I'd reached the point where I was talking about the three types of street that you got in an Islamic city. But of course, an Islamic city is a descendant of the ancient cities of Asia, particularly those in the Mesopotamian region. And so the types of street were a main street, or a series of main streets, often running from north to south, and then secondary streets off them, which were the centers of neighborhoods. And these secondary streets often ran between two north-south main streets, or were themselves the centers of trees, the main trunk of a tree. And then off them were tertiary streets, which were nearly always, so they were dead-end streets. These types of streets were found all over the Islamic part of Asia and in the pre-Islamic areas in both in the Indus Valley and in Mesopotamia. Now I want to move on to enlarge a little bit more on the Islamic city. So now in the next picture, I'm showing you how they coped with the severe climate of the semi-arid desert. It was very difficult to have streets which were too sunny when the sun was so extremely hot. And so they tended to allow the owners of the houses to build across the streets, providing they left enough space for light and air to come through. So this is a deserted but very typical town in northern Saudi Arabia, where we have one of the main streets covered with houses. Going to the great city of Cairo, the biggest city in the world in the early Middle Ages, in the central Middle Ages, one of the problems is that the buildings are enormous, but the streets are quite narrow. And so they had to solve the problem of two vehicles passing each other in a narrow street. And you can see how they did that with very narrow vehicles that are about 1.5 meters wide. These vehicles were still running in Cairo 40 years ago, and I'll show you a number of different kinds of them in a moment. But one interesting characteristic is the enormous wheels. This was to make sure no matter how rough the terrain was, the vehicle could get through. So the wheels are bigger than the span of the vehicle. When the French and the British came in the 1860s with the building of the Suez Canal and began to take over control of Cairo, they brought in the Western kind of vehicle, but it still had to be very narrow in Cairo. And so here you see communal vehicles for transport from one end of the city to the other. Now, a city that is 1 million in the Middle Ages is going to be a very big city. And Cairo was 7 miles long along the river. Now, to transport people for a distance of 7 miles from one location to another, you obviously needed buses or transport of some kind. And so they had a communal system, what we would call perhaps communal taxis, whereby anybody could hail a vehicle passing, one of these vehicles, a shared taxi, and hire and climb on, and for a small fee, be transported as far as they wanted to go and then climb off again. So there are various names for these kinds of shared taxi. The Turkish word is dolmuş. And you could get as many as 20 people or 10 people with their luggage onto such a shared vehicle. Usually they were drawn by horses, but sometimes by camels. Now, I also talked last week about the wakala. Here's a very famous one, the wakala of the bazaar. They were often down in the market areas, very central, beautifully located, because they had craftsmen working in them. And it was a very desirable place to live, right in the center of the city. And so the apartments above the the craftsmen were very highly priced in rent, and they had elegant balconies, as you can see, and they often faced both ways, as I mentioned, inwards and outwards. Here is one seen from the front, a grand balcony. It's obviously a lovely apartment up there. 2 levels. There's upper level and the main level. And there's another very quite comfortable sleeping accommodation above the shops. Main entrance in there. And here's one of these narrow vehicles carrying grain. Here is another entrance to our Wakala, a grand entrance. Notice that, of course, since they were built in the early or Middle Ages, the street levels have gone up, so you have to go down flights of stairs to get into them now. And here are the plans. So the bigger apartments, let's take these that face out. You see you go through a lobby, often with a bathroom off it, and then you have the main room with its balcony, and above half of it is a mezzanine. These sections are of houses, of smaller apartments that don't have a mezzanine jutting into the room, but you get a sense of the whole complex. Here, though, we have a typical planned section of an apartment where you have a bathroom at the entrance, a small cooking area, a dining alcove, a main sitting area, and above it, the upper part has, looking onto it, a mezzanine, which is open both ends. And that's what they look like inside. This is, of course, a recent photograph taken 40 years ago. They've tried to get the scale over the sitting area down, but actually, as you can see, the outside wall goes all the way up to the double height. However, they were luxury apartments. Most workers lived in a housing like this, where they would have 1 or 2 rooms off a narrow staircase, and there'd be a whole series of doorways and staircases going up. So you would tend to have about 30 or 40 or 50 people living on each staircase, and perhaps 6 or 8 in a room. Very tight accommodation. Sometimes accommodation like this was entered from balconies at the back, and then they began to look very like ancient Greek or Roman multiple housing. Looking at the main streets and the way in which they appeared, we can go back to the French expeditions of Napoleon and the visitors after that, who did watercolors and paintings of the character of the streets in Cairo, and to get some sense of the great beauty of the way in which they displayed the goods in the street under awnings, which are often multicolored. The buildings themselves, if they were important buildings, would be identified by checkered or striped patterns on the building. And so the great gateways were identified that way, and they had minarets on them, relating them to the adjoining mosque on the right. On the left, you see a typical Wakala with its great gateway there. And here are the stripes done in stonework as you go into the mosque, very beautifully decorated. And then the mosque itself is quite tight because it's a very dense urban community. And so the main prayer area is actually open to the sky, but often with an awning over it, and becomes a courtyard. And the sanctuary with the Qibla wall and the niche is quite small. Where the market was very important, or the entrance to the buildings were very important, they frequently covered the main street with a roof. And this is a roof which actually links 2 religious buildings. One is a mosque, and the other is an associated craft center related to the mosque. And when you come to the craft center of the goldsmiths, the silversmiths, the jewelers, they covered the street the whole way. It's in semi-ruins now, but you can see there was elaborate housing above. Notice how the minarets stand out against the sky all the time. When you were passing down the street, you could always identify the mosques or the important buildings by the striped decoration or checkered decoration and the minarets. And that was true even in the side streets. So here's the main street of a quarter with the mosque standing out very clearly with its stripes and the minaret. Notice that the housing is cantilevered at the first floor, as it was in medieval Europe, which may have got the idea from here, so that you get larger accommodation upstairs. So now we come to a new topic altogether, and that is the question of designed cities. I've shown you how cities evolved naturally as tribespeople moved into the city areas and created their own neighborhoods. But now I want to talk about the design of cities. The urge to design a city, of course, comes with a sense of authority and power and grandeur. And so we have a series of periods in history when rulers tried to design cities. We aren't very well informed yet through archaeology of the design of cities before the period of the Greeks. We know, of course, about Hippodamus of Miletus, who designed Priene anew as an ordered plan for the Greeks of the Periclean age. But we don't know anything about the Assyrian design of cities yet. Free archaeology hasn't gone far enough. But we do know that the Assyrians originally designed Damascus in its present form. So here is modern Damascus. And this is the part that we have good knowledge of the Assyrians designing in 900 BC, between 900 and 800 BC. It's called the street named Straight, or the street called Straight. And it is still the main street of Damascus. It's an amazing thought, isn't it? The oldest main street in the world that we know of. And the buildings go down on either side 14 feet below the modern street level. It's an extraordinary experience to go into them and go down another floor to the original main floor of the shops and the workshops. Now, when the Greeks came along, of course, and it became a major Hellenistic city, the Greeks redesigned the sanctuary area, which presumably was in exactly the same place, and that tended to be what they did. And the Greeks had a great temple on an axis, and it was centered there, and approached up an axial approach from the agora, which the Greeks also built. And there was another central axis going out that way, which survives a bit in the market. Then when the Romans came, of course, the Romans rebuilt everything. And so we had a great Roman temple there. And you see the huge size of the sanctuary, very formal. And then when the Muslims came, they had the problem of what to do with it. Actually, I've left out one step, and that is that the Christians converted the Roman temple, the Roman-Greek temple, into a church. And that was axial, again, inside the axis. But for the Muslims, that didn't work. As you can understand, the orientation of prayer had to be at right angles for the Muslims. And they needed to have, so the focus was in a different direction from that of it was south, whereas the focus of the Roman temple had been east. And so they needed to change the plan, and so they had to rebuild the whole building. Hence you get the Umayyad mosque built 70 years after Islam was founded, and involved tearing down the whole of the Roman temple. But otherwise they placed it in exactly the same place in the middle of the sanctuary. And the Greco-Roman arcades and entrance stairs are still there. Now we're around the outside wall of the sanctuary. This is the outside wall here on the left. And we're looking at some of the accretions that have happened around the outside. Of course, the street is, even though it's gone up in level, it's still below the level of the sanctuary itself. and we're heading in the direction we're pointing. We're looking towards the Agora. Now there's one other element, and that of course is the palace of the ruler, which seems to have been relocated. It's now in a corner of the plan, dominating and controlling the city, presumably done in Islamic times. And so that is the modern castle of the city. Now there's one last thing to discuss, and that is what happened to the regular plan. The dotted line shows the original lines of the street. And so how do we explain that those lines were destroyed? Well, after Damascus was captured, conquerors took very lenient approach to the Christians for two reasons. Firstly, because Damascus capitulated without a serious fight. And secondly, because Muslims regarded Christians as brothers. They all worshipped the same God. And so the Christian population of Damascus remains to this day, and it's a very high percentage of the population. The last count, it was about 30% Christian. So presumably where the Christians were living, they were able to retain their own streets. And so we have a series of straight streets. And there are sections of the plan which are still very rectilinear. But when the tribes moved in, they wanted to space themselves away from both the Christians and from other tribes. And so they created their own main streets, which go off at a crazy angle and have the conventional dead-end streets off them. And so we get a mixture here of the design by accretion and design by formal planning. And the two are mixed up. The formal plan being replaced by accretion. We can see how it happens all over the city. See, not surprisingly, near the market, you get a Christian area. Incidentally, that area is where you get Damascus lace, and a lot of printing materials and paper are made in that area. Now, the same destruction of the formal Hippodamian planning of the Greeks took place all over the Hellenistic world, wherever the Muslims conquered. So here we are in ancient Antioch, modern Adana, and here in Antioch is the ancient Greek market, which had very formal colonnades on both sides of the street, with the shops regularly behind. And here is the modern market, where the accretion, natural accretion, has been allowed to replace the formal. I have, over the years, talked to many Muslims about the legal attitude to accretion, and they're amazingly tolerant of it. Some friends of mine were having a neighbor build a high house next to them, only a few feet away, and I said, don't you want to object to this? It's going to block your view and your light and your air. They said, oh, well, as long as it's a bit spaced away and we've got some light and some air, we can't complain. And they just put up with it. It's an amazing tolerant attitude. And it's part of that social quality that the Muslim world has that we have lost. Now you can see what accretion does to a formal plan, because here is the military city of Kufa, the first great Muslim city to be built after the conquests in southern Iraq. And it was originally clearly a very regular plan. And by the time this drawing was made, around, they think about 1100 AD, that is about 400 years after the town was built, accretion had completely destroyed most of the formality, leaving only the main streets. So you have the 4 main streets coming in that direction, the 3 main streets in that direction, another one surviving here, another one surviving here. A diagonal street has been built in, going off to another major city. But everything else has become chaotic accretion. Of course, it's not probably a very careful plan. It's just an artist's idea of the town. We do know what these early Islamic towns looked like. from some of the archaeology that's been done. And this is one where the archaeologists have reconstructed the arcade. And so there was a tendency to have very elegant pointed arched arcades, very light and gracious. And this is long before Gothic. This is 700 AD along the main streets. Very much on the pattern of the Hellenistic cities. And this one is in Lebanon. You get some idea of what the streets might have looked like by looking at the courtyard of the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, where you get the same sort of arcading, and you would have had shops behind them. Of course, there were other patterns of organization which were favored in the ancient world. So going back to prehistory, this is the Assyrian view of the world, and it's also the Assyrian view of a fortified town. And we know that in many parts of Asia, the cross-axial plan for an ordered town was favored. So you frequently get rectangular towns, but you also got circular towns. And this is only one ruined example, but there were some very large circular cities built by the ancient Persians. So it's not surprising that when the rival dynasty, the Abbasids, who were rivals of the Umayyads, were successful in war in the middle of the 8th century AD, they decided to found a great center for Islam on the Tigris, Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia, and to plan it as a model of the universe. So it's a circular plan, a cosmological plan, with cross axes and the great mosque in the center dominating the whole plan. Around the edge were camps for the army. Of course, it's a double wall. Let's get this to work. There were a series of gates, and then there were a double wall, camps for the army, and then estates of the important rulers, and then inside a series of more accretions areas for the workmen. But most of the workmen, in fact, lived outside. So here's an archaeological study, but it's actually based more on literature than on fact, because they have not actually been able to locate a gate like this. So here is the bent entrance described in the literature, the outer courtyard going across the great ditch between the two walls, a second inner courtyard over the second ditch, and then we come to the first great market leading up to another inner ditch before we come to the first camps of the military. It was a huge city. And here's a reconstruction of it. And so at a certain stage, this is very diagrammatic, the circular city had the nobility and the great, and the ruler, the caliph, and the great establishment for the army inside it. And then outside, there were accretions of workmen's areas and craft shops and so on that grew rapidly with time as the city grew to slowly take over from Cairo as the biggest city in the world. And it lay between the two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And so this is the ancestor of modern Baghdad, although, as I say, the actual location of the gates and the design of it has not been archaeologically excavated because it's in the middle of the urban area. But we do know something about how planning went on in early Islam, because in the early 800s, the caliphs of Baghdad found that living in that round city was chaotic. There was too much life. It was too crowded. They wanted more style in their way of life. And so they decided to move 70 miles upstream to create a new capital called Samarra. Now, it was a huge capital, and its great wealth only lasted about 150 years. And then it was abandoned. And so although there is a modern Samarra in part of it, and it has been in the news in the last 12 months, the ancient Samarra is largely deserted, and they were able to excavate it in the last 200 years. So here is ancient Samarra exposed to the air again, and you see how regular the design of the town was. Areas of open space and areas of formal design, separating tribes in a formal way, separating sections of the army from each other and sections of the royal establishment from each other. All planned along the river, and curiously enough, at an angle to the river, because the importance of the south direction was so great that the city is at an angle. So you would enter from the river and you would come into forecourts and then up great flights of stairs into the palace proper, and at the back of the palace would be marvelous gardens, and at the end of the gardens there would be sports fields and racetracks and so on. And here are some of the military establishments and the workmen's establishments. And we've actually, because the city survived for 150 years as the capital of the caliphs, this is where Harun al-Rashid lived. We have about 7 of the major palaces that have been excavated. And so I'm showing you a couple of them. They all vary slightly from each other. Here, for instance, you get out of your boat on the river at the bottom, come in through a great gateway and up to the central courtyard of the palace, and there's the throne room, a cross throne room, in the tradition of the Persians. And these are the various courtyards for the apartments of the attendants and members of the royal family on either side. And here indeed is a reconstruction, I think. I'm sorry it's so bad, but you get a sense of the grandeur of the palace. And another palace, very similar sort of plan. Notice the great balcony here. It must have been this is the main throne room, but this is mainly the main reception area, looking into the garden. And we have standing still above ground level some of the great gateways of these palaces. And I just wanted to show you the walls of the throne room to give some idea of the character of the room and the decoration. You see the great niches, circular niches above the arches. And there's a lot of stucco decoration in these buildings, so it's very beautiful. There were also great mosques, and the mosques were identified by huge man-made mountains, holy mountains, which were, of course, the minarets, but they're now in the ziggurat tradition. So I'm sorry, the slides aren't very good, but you can see the character and how much survives. Most of the outside wall of the mosques is still standing, and there are 2 great mosques surviving. Again, not a very good slide, but you do get a sense of the ziggurat and the outside wall of the mosque. At the top of the mosque, there were a series of circular windows and the ziggurat. Enormous scale, of course, because money was no object, and this is a very flat plain. So these are huge features which can be seen for 7 miles. And here we are in the prayer hall of the mosque, which has lost its roof, but you get a sense of the design of the arches. At the same time, they were developing designed shopping areas for these towns. So this is not quite such an old one, but it survives more or less intact with a lot of modern repair. This is in Baghdad itself, and it's a very good shopping complex with a great central double volume and wonderful decorations in the roof. We'll look at some more of those in a moment. Sorry the slide isn't very good, but we'll have to find out why. This, though, is the first example of a public space that we have in modern times in Asia. Now, I say in modern times because, of course, the ancient Greeks did accept that there was some sort of a public space. In their case, it was part of the agora. Then the Romans, of course, produced a forum, a place in which it was possible for a congregation or a military display to take place in the city. But that was no tradition in the rest of the Asian world for that. There was no tradition in China or Japan or in any of the South Asian countries for a public display or any public participation in government. So there were no public spaces. But somehow the great ruler Tamburlaine in Central Asia got hold of the idea that there ought to be a public celebration of the wealth and importance of his reign. And so he had the idea of transforming the market into a great public space. We don't know where he got the idea from, but presumably from one of the many Western embassies who were attending on Tamburlaine. Tamburlaine even had Western doctors and teachers. So there was a definite wide contact between the Central Asian government at that time and the West. So probably it was a Western influence, the idea of the public space. Or maybe he got the idea, he and his advisors got the idea from what remained of some of the Greek cities. Anyway, it's very formally designed. You have an access from the open side of the square, which opened onto a main street. And the access goes through the square to the center of a great mosque. And then balancing each other on either side on a transverse axis, two great madrasas, teaching schools. Those three buildings are not Tamburlaine's or Timur's original buildings. They were all rebuilt after his death. The one on the left is the oldest, built by his grandson. The one on the right is about 50 years later, and the mosque about 50 years after that.
Right.
Yes.
When you say rebuilt, do you mean that the functions are the same and they've rebuilt the buildings?
Yes, yes. The functions are the same. They were originally madrasas and originally a mosque,
Yeah.
but they're just rebuilt to make them more glorious than they were before. The Central Asians and the Mughals, who were close relations, of course, were very much in architectural competition with each other, as they would with the Persians. And these groups of people were always trying to outdo each other architecturally. So one of the reasons, perhaps, for the beauty of the Taj Mahal and of the great buildings of the Mughals is that they were competing so much with these other civilizations. So indeed, the mosque is contemporary, or very nearly contemporary, with the Taj Mahal, the one at the far distance. Now, that is rather an artificial view of it. That's a photograph I took, I think. But it is what the French advisors did in the 19th century and early 20th century. They advised them to make the Russians to make this into a very glamorous tourist place with a soleil lumière and so on. But actually, it shouldn't look like that. It should look like that. It was a marketplace, after all. So this is a 19th century photograph. Here is one of the platforms that was built in the 19th century by the French advisors for tourists to stand on to watch the soleil lumière. But it's a magnificent group. What is important about it is the two teaching madrasas. What happened in the period, this was all done in 1400, around 1400 AD, was that the great teaching schools attracted learned scholars from all over the known world, both from China and from Italy and France. And so it became one of the greatest universities in the world, the building on the left. And there it is. It's lost the top of its minarets, but otherwise it's pretty intact. And you see how very beautifully designed it is. So it's about 200 years older than the Taj Mahal. and yet very, very beautiful, isn't it? And here's the courtyard. Unfortunately, the courtyard has been wrecked because the Uzbek government in the 1990s decided to reconstruct it and redecorate it. So it's not any longer as authentic as it should be. But here we get a sense of the character of design. This is the other madrasa, a great entrance. This is the view from that area, that open space called the Registan, looking up towards the Great Mosque. Now, the Great Mosque is in total ruins, but I want you to get some idea of the scale of it. Look at the arch of the great prayer hall on the Qibla wall. It's amazing scale, isn't it? These were phenomenal buildings when they were erected, and these are all erected in the early 1400s. And of course, the scale is part of the urbanization. That is, these buildings were meant to be seen in the city landscape as great monuments. And here are my photographs of it today. Well, Timur introduced the idea of embellishing a town and improving it by designing formal public spaces and formal great buildings in relation to them. And so that became something which other great rulers had to model and to copy. And so if we take ancient Isfahan, and on the top you have the great Friday Mosque of Isfahan, and then coming south from it you have, running to the river, you have the market with all the associated buildings of a market, the caravanserais, and some of the teaching madrasas. The ruler Shah Abbas at the beginning of the 1600s, just before the Taj Mahal, he decided that this town needed to be embellished in the same way as Samarkand had been by Timur. So here is an aerial view of the old market with its madrasas and its caravanserais and the great mosque at the top on the left. And this is what the ruler decided to do. Now there is the great mosque, there is the market I showed you, and he decided when it came to an end, he would build a new market which was formally designed and ended axially at the end of a great public space. And not to be outdone, this had to be at least 3 times bigger than the Registan in Samarkand. So it is a huge public space. And it was to be surrounded by grand shops with apartments above them. When you came to the end of it, facing north-south, of course the mosque couldn't be quite on that axis because Mecca wasn't south of Isfahan. Mecca was off to the southwest, I apologize. So Mecca was to the southwest. So he had to turn the mosque at an angle. But all the royal buildings and all the buildings of his courtiers were meant to be axially related to this central space. The whole project was so grand, so ambitious, that it was never complete. That is to say, he built the facades of the great square called the Maidani Shah, and he built the great palace for himself, and he built the 2 great mosques, the Blue Mosque there and the Royal Mosque there, and he built the great market up there, the souk. But only a few of the noble buildings were built alongside, and on that side none at all. And indeed, because it was so large in scale, it wasn't possible for all the shops to be occupied and used. So some of them were simply empty facades and never went beyond that. Notice that there is a main road through here to the river and a grand bridge across the river. And then there is another part of his design, which is a grand boulevard here, the Shababach, or Shabaibach, which ran across the river in a grand bridge. So there were 2 main ways into the city. The Christian community was on this side. So here's with a bit more detail is that plan. And here we are at the north end of the square, looking at the entrance into the souk, the new souk building. And here we are inside it. That's what it looked like inside. And this is a modern photograph of it. Wonderful decoration in the roof again. And there is the Maidan-e-Shah looking the other way towards the south end. And this is the gateway of the great mosque, the Blue Mosque. And here are the shops with the apartments above them. And the apartments all have balconies in front, shaded inside arcades. And here we're looking up from the mosque, which is turned, as I said, at an angle of 45 degrees. We're looking at above the mosque from an aerial photograph into the great Maidan itself. I'm afraid the French also intervened here and introduced a formal French garden into the Maidan. It shouldn't have a garden, of course, it should be paved, because it was a market area. And there you see the scale of the shops around the sides. And here is the balcony of the Royal Palace, looking into the Maidan. It's so big that it has a pool in the middle of the balcony. Here, just to start with some of the buildings, is the courtyard of the Great Mosque. And here is an aerial view from the Maidan, or from the balcony of the palace, looking across the Maidan at the entrance to the mosque and the courtyard of the mosque and the main prayer hall of the mosque. What I wanted to show you is the undeveloped apartments that were never built over the shops. There's the balconies only left. The shops below often used, but no further building done. So there's the plan of the Great Mosque. And there's the approach, the previous photograph was a side view. Here is the main approach into the great hall of the mosque. Again, this is earlier than the Taj Mahal. So you see how much these civilizations were in contact and in contest with each other, in competition. Now we're in the Maidan, the great public space, looking at the shops and the apartments above, and the great entrance to the mosque, and what is visible of the mosque from the square. Now we're still in the Maidan, and we're looking across the French 19th century fountains at the great gateway of the palace and the balcony of the palace above it. And there is the same view, the same complex. And you notice behind the balcony are a whole series of entertaining rooms, three different levels of them. At the bottom you have, of course, the police headquarters and the headquarters of the army to control the palace entrance. Looking up at the roof, which is decorated with mirrors in patterns. And this is the great gateway through to the palace. And exactly across, on the axis across from that, across the other side of the square, is the private mosque of the ruler, the Shah's mosque, seen from ground level. And finally we come to the other great embellishment of the city, which was this great formal street, the Shahbagh. So here is a contemporary drawing of it, and another one. And all the way along it, you had the gateways of the palaces that were owned by the nobility on either side. The Shahbagh itself is a waterway, a canal that runs from a higher level down to the river and is flanked by paved areas and grass. And here it is today. Very, very beautiful idea to put in the middle of a city. So these were the urban improvements of formal design that were brought in by the Safavids, the rulers of what we would call perhaps Renaissance Iran. At the end of the Shahbagh, we have one of the two great rivers, and these are bridges, and you see the bridge is designed so that there's an area for vehicles in the middle of the bridge, and on either side the pedestrian ways through these arches. This is the other bridge, and you see how beautiful the arcades are. And there you are, you see the thing on the bridge on the other side. It's part of a weir, allowing water to be banked up, and it controls the flow of water. Very beautifully designed again. So these don't get as much publicity perhaps as they should, for you could argue that they are urban improvements of a quality that is certainly in competition with anything done in India at this time. Well, now we are in India, or this is modern Pakistan, and here is the contemporary work, exactly contemporary, of the father of Shah Jahan in Lahore. And you can see there's an influence from one side to the other, isn't there? And they're certainly in competition. Now, we don't have any of the urban improvements of the Mughal emperors in India remaining. That is, we don't have any of the main streets remaining. They've all been altered by the British and allowed to be destroyed with time. So you can't actually get a sense of what they were like. But I think these photographs I'm showing you now may give you a hint of what the Mughal emperors were trying to do in their urban design. Something akin to what the Safavids were trying to do in Persia. But of course we do have the monuments left. And so you get a sense of the great designs of space in a formal way in India under the Mughals. So that's just to give you a feeling for ordered design by architects of urban spaces and urban related buildings in the late Islamic period, reaching a high point which would be hard to equal, I think, anywhere else in the world. But, of course, not to last, because the world's economy changed from being centered in Asia to being centered in Europe and America. And so this was the end of the period of wealth in those countries. So I hope that gives you some sense of the achievements of architecture in Asia over the last, let's say, 10,000 years, but maybe a bit more. Are there any questions to end with?
I have a question that may have been covered in another lecture. So I am sorry if it's a repeat, but I was just going to ask about the colour blue for the mosques and where that colour came from in terms of resources.
Good question.
And why blue also.
Yes, it's a good question. It's a greeny blue, actually, a sort of turquoisey colour. And it is said by the early historians, and they're not absolutely contemporary, but they are writing 100 years later, that when the Prophet went into battle and the Prophet's forces were in battle, the colour of the flag was turquoise green. And so that's been assumed to be the colour of Islam. It's curious, we have something of that colour in this room. So many Muslims you would favour green as a colour. Curious enough, it was a colour used a lot in Morocco. And when Europeans started to favour white buildings, they often decided to colour the woodwork green, as they had done in Morocco. So you get white and green. And in Brisbane, in my day, we had lots of white buildings with green shutters and green woodwork.
So did the colour come from, did it come from the ground? Was it a mineral?
Yes. It is. It is a mineral which is green, viridian green. And I don't remember the chemistry. Does anybody remember the chemistry of the green from the ground? But it's very cheap, I think. It's not at all an expensive colour. And so there is an argument, of course, that that's the reason why it was chosen, because it was a very cheap mineral source of colour. And a very pleasing one, of course. I mean, you've got vegetation anyway, and so you're matching the vegetation. Yeah.
The spiral-shaped tower at the start,
Yeah.
you explained that came in a bit late.
Well, it's a ziggurat. I don't know whether archaeologists have actually found a ziggurat from 3000 BC or 2000 BC, which is a spiral. But there was a written tradition, a legend that some of the early ziggurats had been spirals. So because they were in Mesopotamia, when Baghdad was being developed, the caliphs had the idea of making their great sacred mountains continuous with previous civilizations by making them ziggurats.
Does it have anything to do with the Tower of Babel or any of those?
Yes, that kind of thing. And again, it's a purely legend. We don't have any evidence archaeologically. Yeah.
Is the spiral a staircase? Like
Yes, and the spiral is a staircase.
Right.
And you could actually ride a horse up to the top, which the caliphs did. Yeah. Any other questions? These are good questions. Yeah.
Just to do with the arches, the grand gateways.
Right.
Is there any similarity in the monumental arches here that we've seen and those of Rome and Greece, or is it not exactly translated? Was it just sort of later development?
No, I think there is an absolute continuity. My own feeling, and I'm sure you probably realize that too, is there's much more interaction between civilizations than we realize. There always has been more. And it's the educated people who interact. It's the captains of ships and the ambassadors. And they're educated, so they take the ideas back and talk about them, And so they get transferred from one civilization to another. I was going to say more about, yes, I think that when a ruler is wealthy enough and feels secure enough to celebrate his reign by great buildings, he tends to look back at other surviving monuments. And in places like Persia, Persian territories included Iraq and Syria at that time, they had plenty of great monuments built by the Greeks and the Romans. So they were inspired by them to do the same sort of thing. So there is a certain continuity going on, definitely. And we know, of course, that so many ideas came from, first of all, China and later Japan to reach Europe. And before that, so many ideas came from India to reach Europe. And then there were the ideas of Islam that reached Europe. So there's a tremendous amount of interchange going on. Yeah.
And does tiling on the outside of buildings serve some environmental purposes for preservation? Because it seems to be, obviously the decoration is there, but I imagine that less intricate versions of that decoration existed once before.
Yes.
Perhaps
The earliest, to my knowledge, tiling is preceded by mosaic. And it is a very good way of creating a work of art very fairly permanently on a building. And one of the things we forget is that nearly all of these early buildings were brightly colored. And the color's gone, just as it has from the cathedrals. And so if they wanted to try and make the color permanent, they would use something like mosaic and later on tiling. And it was a fairly cheap way of doing it too. I think that answers it, yeah. What's interesting is how early it is. I mean, we're starting to find examples of mosaic going back to the very early periods in Mesopotamia. So the idea of having brightly colored buildings is quite early on. In fact, it hasn't come back. We don't really have brightly colored buildings. Very rarely. Thank you very much. Thank you.